2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I too want to join you in welcoming back to the Honourable the Senate the members of the Youth Parliament. They've been here with us before. We have hosted them in this chamber, and we have had the opportunity to interact with them, and I have every confidence that they are the future of Parliament and parliamentary debate in Barbados, and I am very much looking forward, God willing, to be in a position to observe them speaking from one of these microphones or those in the other place. So welcome to the Honourable the Senate again. Mr. President, I rise with the members of the Youth Parliament here with us to speak about a matter that perhaps is on the opposite side of the spectrum. It covers young people, younger than themselves, but perhaps some of them in the same age category under age 18, as represented in the draft of the Child Justice Bill. The Child Justice Bill, Mr. President, is a piece of legislation that perhaps whose time has long past due and whose time has finally come. Mr. President, as I go through my presentation, I'm going to cover, first of all, the philosophy of this government, why this legislation is important. I'm going to cover, Mr. President, the legislation itself, and I'm going to then cover, Mr. President, the additional pieces of legislation that bind together our philosophy as a government and as a people with our work as legislators, Mr. President. And so, as I get into that third section of my presentation, you will hear me speak more and more about the correlations between the Child Justice Bill, the work on the Child Protection Bill, the work of the Child Care Board and all of the related agencies, and the work more broadly of the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs under the leadership of their minister and all of the well-equipped officers who work there, Mr. President. But let me start first of all by going back to the philosophy of this government. This government, Mr. President, came to office with a mandate for being the representative voice of all people. It has always represented, Mr. President, all people, those who feel as though their voice have agency and those that do not. And one of the very early issues, Mr. President, that we found ourselves confronted with is that relating to children and to youth, and in particular, over successive administrations, how we were seeing young people who felt disenfranchised from governance and from their own nation, feeling as though they had no alternative pathways, Mr. President. What am I talking about when I say that, Mr. President? You've seen this government pilot perhaps the very first, most comprehensive approach to education sector reform. And why would we have done that, Mr. President? Why would a government have taken and made the commitment to a full reform of our education sector? Because, Mr. President, and I have said it before on more than one occasion, in multiple fora, before I was a member of a government and since I have been a member of government, our education sector, education system, is not and has not been for a long time fit for purpose. Our education system, Mr. President, has created, in my view, and I am on record, so I do not retreat from it, and it is something that we have said, perhaps even more recently now, as we just come under the common entrance. I have not been a supporter, Mr. President. Never have I been, publicly or otherwise, a supporter of the common entrance system. I am on record in this very chamber, Mr. President, as saying I believe that the common entrance system and its structure, taking children from primary to secondary, has been an experiment in social sifting. I have said on more than one occasion, Mr. President, that the common entrance system and the system as it is currently structured favors people like me, favors those of us who sit in this honorable chamber, those of us who are academically gifted, those of us who are meant to be on an academic pathway, those who are meant to be future professionals in one way, shape, or form. But it relegates young people from the tender age of 11 to second-class status. It tells you that you are either going on an academic track by going to certain schools, or you are going to something else by going to different schools, doing the identical, for the most part, curriculum, but just being taught at a level that is lower. I am on record as well, Mr. President, in this very chamber, as having said, I went to the St. Michael's School. I have supported the St. Michael's School because it has been a part of who I have been. It has helped to form me. It has helped to frame me. But I have said that my mother worked as the principal secretary at the St. George Secondary School for all my life. I went from St. George Primary to St. Michael's, but I spent all of my holidays at St. George Secondary School with my mother. Every lessons teacher I ever had has come from the St. George Secondary School for the most part. And when St. Michael's ended at 2:15 when the evenings came, I left St. Michael's and I went to St. George Secondary. I lived a parallel existence. I saw children in the St. George Secondary School with my mother who excelled in areas that they would dust me out in a heartbeat. I can't touch them. Put me in a classroom with them with English or math or history or those subjects, they have nothing on me. But I've also been on record as saying, who makes me, the academic, better than they are in their own areas of skills? And it is not about giving people more time. It is not about teaching them later. It is not about giving them a chance to develop on its own. It is a structural problem that has had social consequences. And what are those social consequences, Mr. President? We have had generations of young people leaving school with few certifications, feeling excluded from their own country, feeling excluded from their own society. And as a result, many of them feel as though they have nothing to lose. What has resulted is a cycle that is connected then to our social system, to our labor market, Mr. President, and ultimately, in some instances, you have a lot of people who make exemplars of themselves and who go on to do extremely well. In all kinds of disciplines. Technical disciplines, vocational disciplines, yes, and academic disciplines when they find their pathways. But we have seen people who have come through the system who have nonetheless, and despite our system, and I don't say they have thrived because of it, they have thrived despite it. So this is a government, Mr. President, that has said, we are not satisfied with even one child, far less the thousands who have passed through generations upon generations upon generations, who have felt excluded from our country, from our society, from feeling as though they have a right to be. We have said as a government that the starting point for this has to be a complete reconstruction of the education sector from primary through secondary, and we have extended it now to make sure that there's provision for pre-primary. We have made the commitment, Mr. President, that because no other government prior to this administration has tackled it in this comprehensive a way, that is not something that can be rushed. And while some may want to politicize it for reasons of their own and oversimplify it, we leave them with that, Mr. President. But the reality of it is that this government has made the decision to take its time and do that which must be done in education well, with all of the stakeholders sitting at the table, by engaging with all of the partners so that the outcome benefits all Barbadians. The rationale, Mr. President, for us being in a position to do that body of work is to make sure that not only are we equipping every child for greatness and making sure that every child feels as though they are a star, but that every child then has a pathway that they have crafted for themselves. But it fundamentally also, Mr. President, is about a changing of minds and hearts. Changing of minds and hearts. I had the opportunity to speak with the principal of one of the entities that will be designated in here as a secure residential facility by this legislation, and I will come to the legislation in the second part of my presentation. And in so doing, the principal said to me, what they see is that a lot of these kids that enter the facility between ages 12 and currently now up to 16, that these kids come with anger. They come with this anger that cannot be explained. They come with this anger at the world and at all kinds of things. And they don't know why. And when you start to interrogate to find out what is causing this anger, somebody look at me bad. They got beef with somebody because she passed and didn't speak to me, or she passed and I don't like how she look at me. All kinds of things that, for most of us in this room, are foolishness. But under the wrong circumstances, then that finds its way in the criminal justice system. And we see, more often than not, and regrettably, a cadre of young people, and I've said this here as well in this honorable chamber. I am the mother of a 24-year-old, soon to be 25 in September. And I remember when she was in secondary school, she always used to talk about the fact that in the court pages always had young people who didn't look that different from her in terms of age. They were all her same age, and she couldn't understand how these kids were finding themselves in front of the justice system. This legislation, Mr. President, as I go from philosophy to the legislation itself, this legislation attempts to capture the philosophy of a government that believes in inclusion, a government that believes in people, a government that believes that everyone deserves a chance to be, a chance to thrive, a chance to excel, and a chance to be seen and heard. That is the philosophy of this government. So how does it then find itself colliding with the actual legislation itself, Mr. President? In the legislation, you have, in the other place, Mr. President, you have the House of Assembly referring the legislation in draft as a bill to a joint standing committee on the social sector and the environment. That joint select committee constituted members of this honorable chamber and that of the other members of the other place, and it was open to the public. It was open to the public, Mr. President, because again, the philosophy of this government is about inclusion. It is about giving people an opportunity to be heard and to be seen. It is about the opportunity, whether you have contending views or not, to be able to put those views on the table, and where there are merits, that those merits can be incorporated. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that that standing committee made a series of recommendations to the legislation, which I will come to, but I will go through the primary legislation first. Mr. President, the Child Justice Bill, as it stands now, has a number of sections captured in it. It was developed out of the work of a cabinet subcommittee led by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and they had the benefit of a consultant coming from UNICEF. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and so Children and Education Fund. And so they then led a 3-month consultancy with the ministry to be able to look at the Child Justice Bill, and also in parallel to look at the Child Protection Bill, Mr. President. As a consequence of the Cabinet's directives and the work of the Ministerial Subcommittee, and then the work of the UNICEF consulting team, we now have a bill before us for consideration. And I will go through, as I start the second part of my presentation, the bill itself. The bill, Mr. President, is premised first and foremost throughout its text on what I have outlined in my first elements of the presentation: our philosophy as a people, our philosophy as a government, those principles about all children mattering, all children needing to be seen and heard. That is the premise of the bill. It also, Mr. President, is based on a number of multilateral considerations that come from the external community: the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Administration of Juvenile Justice. They're called, anecdotally, the Beijing Rules. The United Nations Rules for the Protection of Juveniles Deprived of Their Liberty, and the United Nations Guidelines for the Prevention of Juvenile Delinquency, otherwise known as the Riyadh Guidelines. So, Mr. President, as you begin to see the framing of it, first philosophy, second, multilateral guidelines, and you're beginning to then start to dissect how and why the legislation, the bill which is before us, is framed in this way. It looks first at the rights of the child. It looks at children in terms of human rights, the human rights of children. And then it talks about the administrative standards for administrative justice for juveniles. So you're making sure that at all times it is fair, it is fit for purpose, it is well suited to children. Then, Mr. President, we talk about when we cross the Rubicon and we end up now interfacing with the justice system, what do you do in terms of protecting juveniles deprived of their liberty? And then ultimately, Mr. President, even before you get there, you have the prevention mechanisms. The child protection legislation, Mr. President, as it is now called, it has passed through both houses of Parliament, is meant to deal with everything that comes before. Children before they have to interact with the juvenile justice system. Children before as a preventative mechanism. Children before to be able to ensure that they don't find themselves involved in the justice system. It is meant to keep them from where we are now. If all efforts have failed, Mr. President, and if despite everyone's best efforts, and when I say everyone, in this circumstance, Mr. President, I am not speaking about everyone, namely the government, the child care board, the welfare officers, the teachers, the whoever. I am not talking about those everyones. Those everyones are included, yes, but when everyone has failed also includes mother, father, uncle, aunt, grandmother, great aunt, the person who lives next to you, who know you since you're born, and who should be in a position to correct you when they see you going in the wrong way. Sunday school teachers, because you should be going to Sunday school when the Sunday mornings come, or some faith-based to give you the sense that there's something bigger than you, and you are not God. We're talking about the everyone's that includes a society raising its young and making sure that we are gifting a society a future and not creating challenges for ourselves a little later. The everyone finds itself interfacing upfront by way of child protection, and then afterwards there's a role for those same everyone's, if all else fails, in child justice. So the application of the Act is meant to deal with a child who has actually committed an offense and who at the time of the commission of that offense is under age 18. And then you have, I'm going to go through the legislation itself. What is the part 1, which is what I just spoke about. Part 2 then covers the assessment of a child. What do we need to be able to do when that child first interacts with the system? But then I'm going to go into part 3, Mr. President, the assessment of the child, and part 4 as well, securing attendance of the child at the initial inquiry, Mr. President. We have a somewhat well-established criminal justice system for children, how they are processed, apprehended, and processed through assessed, first of all, and then how they go through the criminal justice system in the country. And we want to make sure that a child under 12 years old is not covered in this legislation. So children under age 12 are seen in this legislation at the minimum. The bill provides for the minimum age of criminal responsibility so that a child under the age of 12 is not capable of committing a criminal offense. That's the first element that I want to raise. Then we start to talk about perhaps where philosophy and the everyone's that I spoke about and the legislation also intersect. It is a section that deals, Mr. President, with diversion. When we talk about diversion, Mr. President, believe me when I tell you that this legislation contemplates that everything that possibly can be done to keep a child out of the criminal justice system is meant to be done under this legislation to take a child along a different pathway. And what does that mean, Mr. President? It outlines a range of things. It then speaks about, Mr. President, the purposes of diversion. I've just given a high-level view of that. A child to be considered for diversion under certain circumstances. Levels of diversion options. It gives you every possible opportunity to avoid taking that child through a criminal justice system. It then also, however, as is the nature of rearing children and life in general, actions have consequences. And in order to talk you down from the limb, we want you to be able to say, all right, you know what? I should not have done what I did. I was angry. I was feeling unheard and unseen. My home environment is a challenge for me in this way. My mother maybe do me this, or my father maybe do me that, or I may not have parents and I'm struggling on my own. I have interacted with the system because my own social circumstances are so challenging that I may need some help. When that child under age 18, as covered in the legislation, comes to that right conclusion that I may need some help and I am willing to, 1, accept responsibility for my actions, 2, go along a different pathway captured under the legislation defined as diversion, then you're able to successfully divert. It is in circumstances where, Mr. President, when diversion fails, then you have a consistent almost escalation of how the legislation works. Then you find yourself dealing with court proceedings and you find yourself before the court. The court has a couple of options available to you, and that's one of the areas that I will come to now in the legislation, because the legislation identifies in parts 10 and 11 a couple of things that I want to spend a moment on. One, a secure residential facility. Let's deal first with that. What is a secure residential facility? And what we historically would have known as the government industrial school is going to be defined once this legislation has been successful. If it has been successful through this honorable chamber, the government industrial school will then be defined as a secure residential facility. Now, I want to spend a moment on that, Mr. President, because this government, in the last estimates of expenditure, which we would have debated in this honorable chamber, has allocated approximately $3 million in this financial year for the purpose of renovating the government industrial school in St. Philip, and to ensure that we're able to deal with what is happening in the building. Mr. President, the building that currently houses the government industrial school was built in the 19th century. It is an extremely old building, 1897 or something like that, I believe, is when the building was constructed. Very old, and if you know that old building, those are old soft stone buildings, much like this one, and I know the honorable member, Senator King, would know this very well. So it is an old building, and so you're constantly in need of renovations, constantly in need of pumping money into that facility. This year, $3 million have already been allocated. I'm advised by the facility, Mr. President, that they have already laid the foundation to begin the process of moving the principal, the deputy principal, as well as the accounting and administrative staff out of the building into temporary office accommodation in order to allow for those renovations to take place in earnest. That work is underway, Mr. President, in the interest of making sure that we have a genuinely secure residential facility in a building that is fit for purpose. So in that facility, Mr. President, you have a range of things which are meant to happen. I'm advised also, Mr. President, and I'm proud to be in a position to share this with the Honorable Chamber, that they are well underway with ensuring that children in their care benefit from not just the existing curriculum, but that the facility has now been designated as a certified CVQ facility. Previously, this is the vocational qualification, Mr. President, and that previously the students who were there, the children who were there, had to be entered through other facilities, Springer Memorial, Queens College, whomever else to do their subjects. Now the facility itself has been so designated as of last year, and the resources provided to ensure that they can deliver on the courses. They are providing courses, Mr. President, in carpentry, masonry, English. You have children who are doing their CXCs. Before, Mr. President, as you would recall, and Senator King would know this, the age at which children went in or came out, the years would have been, typically the sentence would have been 3 years or somewhere thereabouts, and children would remain there until their 16th birthday or just before, and then they would be released depending on what the offense was at the time. Now, the facility will be a secure residential facility. It covers up to the age that we have spoken about, Mr. President, but we are seeing sentences now, I am told, in the vicinity of 18 months with a possibility for review, which gives that child an opportunity not to spend their entire time in a facility, but to have a chance at genuine reintegration. And that brings me to the other element that I want to speak with, which is just that, reintegration. Mr. President, everybody knows somebody who was in a facility of some kind. Whether it is big person's prison, whether it's in in my time, it used to be Somerville and Dodds, whether it is in government industrial school, whether it is in rehab, everybody knows somebody who was in a facility. It's a small society. Some of us may not, but everybody knows somebody, I think. Even if it is by secondhand information, you may know somebody. And it is hard, Mr. President, it is hard. It is hard to get Barbadians to accept that people have fallen and they can get back up. Mr. President, it's hard. The minute that you hear this boy went to jail, you don't want no cutting your grass no more. You don't want no working around your house no more, Mr. President. The minute that you hear that they went to jail and they're running an electrical business, you don't want them to come and fix you lights no more, Mr. President. But if we don't give people who have genuinely rehabilitated and been rehabilitated, submitted to the discipline of a facility that we have set up to say, I take responsibility for what I have done. It was my fault. I needed to do better. I am willing to do and be better. If we don't give them a chance, Mr. President, no, I am not saying to you or to me, myself, all right, if you are a bandit, you are committed to being a bandit all your life, then perhaps society may not be in a position to say, okay, I can give you a chance because you have demonstrated a lack of responsibility and personal accountability. But for people who are willing to try, Mr. President, I am saying grace. Grace. For many of us, the saying there, but for the grace of God go I. If I was raised in a different environment, Mr. President, if I was raised by different parents, if I was raised in a different community, there but for the grace go I. Mr. President, I went to primary school. I didn't go to public primary school. I didn't go to private primary school. And the Reverend is going to speak, I'm sure, in his time. But this is true. We're both, as a matter of fact. I'm not in that, y'all. But one of them married me, so I hope he's real. but the point that I'm trying to make, this is true.
A very important distinction.
One performed my marriage ceremony, yeah. Correct. But I think, Mr. President, the fact of the matter is here now that we have to be that society that gives people grace. I want to take the opportunity to say this. On my phone, you see this device that we have here? Sometimes I just want to pelt my phone out through the window. Honestly, I actually have come to the conclusion in my ripe old age, I don't like phones that much. Don't say anything, Mr. President. I don't like phones that much. At this stage of my life, I have accepted I don't. We spend too much time down in these devices, seeing all kinds of things that are inconsequential, hearing and receiving information on things that have, in some instances, nothing to do with us. So that body that we don't know, that get in an accident up the road, why do you have to see them if they have passed on the ground? What is wrong with you? Why? Somebody got shot. Unless I am law enforcement, I actually don't need to see it. I don't. But this notion that you in 1,001 group chats and everything that happens in the country you want to see, and you subscribe to all of these news, gossip, information sites on social media because you want to see everything. I am saying you are a part of the problem. I'm telling you. And you know why, Mr. President? I grew up in a generation where there's nobody that I know who has not fallen. I know Gregory Nichols since I was 11 years old. He was a bandit all the time. He's a bandit now. But the point I'm making, Mr. President, is that in the era in which Gregory, Senator Nichols, and I grew up, the people who you see today standing here have fallen over time. And with God's grace, we have gotten back up. And we have been able to be restored in some instances, to be forgiven in other instances, and to be redeemed in other instances, and to be allowed to live and thrive and be. I am saying that there's no one I know, from the highest boardroom to the smallest back room, every one of us lived in a time where everything was not recorded on these devices for perpetuity. We lived in an era where we were allowed to fall and get back up without it being captured on video. We fell and got back up in a time where, Mr. President, where everybody, instead of rushing to help us, paused to pull out their phone to record us. I'm saying it to young people who are sitting in this chamber today. We lived in a generation where we were able to become versions of our best selves because we did not live in an era. We did not come up and grow up in an era where social media or people's minds felt that the first thing they needed to do was to record it on their phones. We went to fetes and dances and shows. I went to Mona Campus. I lived in Jamaica as a student for 3 years on Urban Hall. I swear to God, if half of it was recorded, honestly, it was not recorded. It was not. We went to every dance, every show, every fete, Mr. President, everything, everything we went to, without these being there to record it all. I am saying to you, give people who have fallen an opportunity to get back up and to have grace extended to them. Give young people in particular who have fallen and gotten back up an opportunity to have grace. This legislation gives young people an opportunity by way of the reintegration provisions, by way of the establishment of a reintegration board, by way of a child protection board. It gives young people an opportunity for reintegration. I do not want us to look at this legislation as pure legalese. I don't want us to look at this legislation except in the light that I outlined earlier, a philosophy that focuses on people. People having an opportunity to be their best selves, to live and thrive, but in so doing, to fall and to get back up. So, Mr. President, this legislation in Part 5 speaks about diversion. It covers the opportunity, Mr. President, as well, to keep children out of the system. It ensures, Mr. President, in Part 8, that children have access to legal representation, and one of the things that's important in the legislation as it is contemplated, that not only will children have legal representation as provided by the state, but that they must be spoken with. No, I say spoken with, not spoken to. They must be spoken with in a way that they would understand, so that they understand what is before them. It goes on, and as I mentioned, to speak about the secure residential facility, Mr. President, and the section that I was just referring to, which is Part 11 on reintegration, the establishment of the reintegration board, the functions of the reintegration board, and how that is meant to be supported. Then, Mr. President, it covers a couple of key things that I want to focus on here in terms of the interaction in my last section, the interaction between the Child Justice Bill and the Child Protection Bill. Mr. President, as I mentioned before, these things must go together. And sometimes a child is not bad just because a child is bad. One of the things about this legislation, Mr. President, is that it introduces the concept of parental accountability. I have said I am the mother of a 24, almost 25-year-old, and I was quite happy to see one of my colleagues look at me sideways, thank you. But yes, I don't cede responsibility to anybody for raising my child. And I don't mean that in terms of, you can't tell my child nothing. That's not what I mean. I mean that I feel as if it is my responsibility as a parent to gift society a child that everyone can look at with some degree of responsibility and to say, she had a responsible parent. We have, Mr. President, a generation, perhaps it's been societal, and I believe that the Honorable Deputy President has spoken about it very recently, who themselves lack accountability and who their parents don't know what is accountable. How many times have we heard, Mr. President, about schools having to put parents off the compound because they come and want to fight with teachers? They want to beat teachers. Don't tell my child nothing. Don't discipline my child. Not abuse, don't discipline my child. And you have parents who will come to the school, and if they can't come into the school, Lord help you. That is something for which somebody will for sure pull out their cell phone and record the cussing down that will take place perhaps outside of the school compound in front of the entrance of the school. Skin out your clothes, get on bad, carry somebody there. All kinds of things have happened. When you are dealing with a child, Mr. President, I always used to say to my daughter, don't watch And the boy on TV, you know, don't watch superstars, don't watch models, don't watch them. You watch me. Because what you see on TV and what you see in a photo in a single moment of time or in a video is not real. Social media, even for all of our lives, is not real. I actually don't like social media, for the most part. I post occasionally on Instagram. I don't have Facebook again. I never had Twitter. I don't know what X is. I've heard about it, but I'm here as a replacement for Twitter. I don't know what TikTok is. I've heard about it, but I don't have it. Because, Mr. President, after a while, overconsumption of too much information and all kind of esoteric things, I feel as though I start to lose a couple of brain cells as I consume too much of it. So I curate what I see, I curate what I consume, because after a while, if it is not positive, if it is not developmental, if it is not beneficial, if it is not progressive, I don't need to consume it. Mr. President, think about my coffee cup. Everybody knows I always got a coffee cup close by. It's a standard thing for me. Imagine filling up my coffee cup, Mr. President, with brine. And every time I turn, I fill it up 3/4 ways with brine. And only the rest of the way, a quarter of the way, I actually get my coffee or my tea. I am choosing that my cup must be filled with that which is good. I am not taking up space in my cup with things which don't add value. So I curate what I see, what I hear, what environments I put myself into. I curate it almost perhaps slavishly because my cup must not have things in it. I must not consume from my cup things which are not beneficial to me, things that will not help society through me. I purposed in my heart that I'm not doing it. So I say here, Mr. President, that when we start to deal with accountability for parents, parents have to understand that what you pour into a child, if it is predominantly good, that is what comes back out. If you pour in abuse, cursing, drugs, neglect, all kinds of things, that is what will come out a lot of times, Mr. President. And so we have to pour into the cups that are our children that which we want to come back out, and what we want to come back out must be that which is good and beneficial to a collective community and a collective society. And that is why this legislation, Mr. President, holds parents accountable. It includes a provision in here, Mr. President, under administrative penalties, where a parent is accountable for the things that they can be found culpable when their child is before the court. So when you go and mash up the people brand new buses, and you friends record it, and you go home and you parents say, not my child, okay, no problem. Let me sort this out. You are responsible. And so the way in which the legislation is meant to interact is meant to provide for full-on accountability. Accountability by the child up until the point where we can divert them away from the court system, taking responsibility in a healthy way. Once you have interfaced with the system, then you are going to be dealing with how to make sure that you are protecting the rights of that child, even in the justice system. You're going to then be dealing with how to reintegrate them into the facility, how to support the once they leave the facility, how to support them when they're in the secure residential facility, Mr. President, and then ultimately to make sure that we are gifting our children and supporting our children, those who are the most vulnerable a lot of times among us, with a chance to live, to be seen, to be heard, and ultimately, Mr. President, to thrive. This is what this legislation is about. The government, in the way in which it has treated to it, has created a report. The report has been laid in Parliament. It is available for all to see. It captures the child protection legislation. It captures the child justice legislation. It captures the recommendations made by the Standing Committee. The Standing Committee's recommendations are captured in the matrix coming out of the committee. There are just 2 pages of recommendations, the majority of which have been integrated into the draft of the bill, which is before us. And so, Mr. President, I am confident that this is a start. I'm not suggesting that it is the be-all and the end-all. It is certainly not the end. This is perhaps the most comprehensive body of work for child protection and child justice that has been done in this country for decades. We have heard in the other place, the Honourable Minister, with responsibility for the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, speak about the reforms that will take place on the child protection side. And you've heard the work being done with the Child Care Board, the creation of a social services agency that is comprehensive in its treatment and its dealing with these matters, Mr. President. And I am confident that children, all children, children come from all walks of life, can be supported first through the child protection legislation, protecting the rights of the child, and if, God forbid, they find their way into the justice system, that the child justice legislation, as it's drafted, gives an opportunity for those rights to still be protected and those children to still have the benefit of grace. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like Senator Cummings, I wish to make some reference to the big event this week, and that, of course, is, well, before tomorrow, but more importantly than tomorrow, I believe, is to congratulate all of the Barbadian children who sat the 11+ exam, who put their all in, and who did their best. And Mr. President, I raise that because year after year after year, I am perturbed by how we continue to respond to common entrance results. I'm not talking about reform at the moment, but I'm talking about how we respond as a society. And Mr. President, in particular, how the media responds. I follow an educator in Barbados on one of those social media platforms that the Honorable Senator just says she rather not engage with. But you can get some good stuff over there. For example, Senator Nichols is a blogger. He said that in here, that he blogs on cricket in particular. And so you can find some things that are worthwhile looking at. You do oftentimes get some good information. You meet people that way. And this particular educator, every year, bigs up his students, and his students are diverse in terms of ability and social background. And I get excited. I look out for it every year. And Mr. President, I'm asking that you allow me to read one of this year's posts. And I spoke to that educator directly. And if you will permit me, I will name that educator. I think it's really important. I would like everybody to go and look. Akil Eiffel of the Eiffel School, Eiffel Lessons, has said this year about a particular student. And I'm going to cite this with his permission, because oftentimes he deals with students who are very challenged. And at the end of the common entrance, he says, this is what they have done, and this is the school they're going to. And those schools are across the spectrum, and that is what I like about it. Our media and our government, when it does its report, does not say this student improved their performance over their primary school experience and is going to this school, and that is a good thing. And that's what we need to do. We need to make all of our children feel that when they get that result, when they open that slip, what they are doing is patting themselves on the back for completing one phase. And I'm talking about society. We need to make the children feel this way, because it's not just parents, because when these children walk around and people say to them what school you're going to, if you don't call certain names, they are made to feel like they are less than, and that is not okay, and it has to stop. And that is on all of us, all of us. And these children need to pat themselves on the back, and they need to say, phase 2. This is just another step. That's what I tell mine. It's just another step to you achieving a goal that you set for your life. That is how we need to look at it. If it were up to me, we'd eliminate all of these fake stages, Mr. President, and have a system that lets children go through the educational system. They are tested for ability, not tested for separation and classification. That is what we need to do with our educational system. I have to say, based on what is promised, we're not going to stop that, but we need to stop it. Mr. President, this is what was said by Mr. Eiffel. Last year, I received a call from a parent asking about lessons for her daughter, which was followed by a message or two with information regarding the child. She let me know that her daughter was in class 4 and that she was having difficulty with aspects of her English and mathematics. The mother, let me leave out that part. On November 10th, they lost their home to fire. They lost everything, every single thing. It was a difficult time, yet every time I saw this woman at lessons, she smiled, she kept trotting on. That student was understandably distracted, and at the end of the first term, the improvement she made previously could not be seen. She was struggling with her English and essay aspects of the exam. She wasn't focused. She had a quiet anger. She wasn't still. Christmas camp passed, and it was now the beginning of the second term, and I wasn't seeing my student at lessons. After a call, her mom reached out and informed me that she was moving again from one part of the island, but informed me she would be coming the next time. I'm just going to paraphrase this part. They had a loss in the family, and that too rocked that child. And Ms. Eiffel goes on to say, Easter was approaching. We had a very popular Easter camp for 11+ students, and once again, she wanted the student to attend. When she came to camp, my focus was simple: make her laugh. And this is a reflection on her sorrow, because a relative very near and dear to her, her grandmother, had been ill. She was present in the home, and the child had to bear that experience. My focus was simple: make her laugh. She didn't have an attitude, but she wasn't her normal self, and I tried to lift her spirit. Sometimes teaching isn't about putting anything on a screen or giving a note. Sometimes it isn't even about explaining a difficult topic. Listening. Just listen to your child and your students. I asked her how she was feeling, and we sat and talked. She spoke about her feelings regarding